Question 1. Which of the following scenarios best illustrates the difference between a motivating operation, MO, and a discriminative stimulus, SD? A. Seeing a stop sign, SD, causes you to press the brake, behavior, which avoids a ticket, reinforcement. Feeling hungry, MO, makes food more valuable. B. Feeling tired, MO, makes sleep a strong reinforcer. And seeing your bed, SD, signals that sleeping is possible there. C. Hearing the doorbell ring, SD, makes you open the door, behavior, leading to seeing a friend, reinforcement. Getting attention, reinforcement, makes you likely to open the door again. D. Picking up a toy, behavior, is followed by praise, reinforcement. Wanting the toy, MO, makes you look for it. Answer. B. Feeling tired, MO, makes sleep a strong reinforcer, and seeing your bed, SD, signals that sleeping is possible there. This question asks you to distinguish between an MO and an SD, two very important concepts in understanding behavior. The key difference is that an MO, like feeling tired, changes how much you want something, makes sleep more reinforcing, and how likely you are to do things to get it. An SD, like seeing your bed, doesn't change how much you want it, but it signals when or where you can get that reinforcer. Option B shows feeling tired changing the value of sleep, MO, and the bed signaling where you can access it, SD. The other options confuse the roles or describe consequences. Remember, most change motivation and SD's signal opportunity. Question 2. A child typically bites their hand when asked to do difficult math problems. This behavior is maintained because the teacher removes the math problems after the biting occurs. The function of this behavior is most likely A. Tangible. B. Attention. C. Automatic. D. Escape. Answer. D. Escape. This scenario describes a behavior maintained by negative reinforcement, specifically escape. The behavior is hand biting, and the consequence is the removal of the math problems, something unpleasant the child wants to get away from. Because the biting leads to getting out of the task, the biting behavior is reinforced and likely to happen again in the future when faced with difficult math. The key clue is teacher removes the math problems after the biting occurs. The child isn't getting an item, tangible, attention. Though that could also be present, the primary result here is task removal, or sensory input from the biting itself being the main factor, automatic. They are escaping the demand. Question 3. You are measuring disruptive behavior in a classroom. You decide to use partial interval recording with 10-second intervals. At the end of your 30-minute observation, what conclusion can you draw about the actual occurrence of the behavior? A. The data likely underestimates the total duration of the behavior. B. The data likely overestimates the total frequency of the behavior. C. The data provides an accurate count of every instance of the behavior. D. The data provides an accurate measure of how long the behavior lasted. Answer. B. The data likely overestimates the total frequency of the behavior. This question probes your understanding of measurement procedures, specifically partial interval recording. Partial interval recording involves marking the behavior as occurring if it happens at any point during the interval, even just for a second. Because you mark the whole interval if the behavior happens even briefly, this method tends to overestimate how often the behavior occurred or the total time it lasted. It's good for detecting if a behavior happened at all within a period, but not for getting a precise count or duration. Frequency gives a precise count, duration gives length, and whole interval often underestimates. Remember that partial interval recording is quick, but can give you a higher number than the behavior truly warrants if it was very brief or didn't happen throughout the entire interval. Question 4. A behavior analyst is teaching a child to request a break by saying, "Break, please." They reinforce the child whenever they say, "Break, please," when they want to escape a task, but do not reinforce them if they just whine or push materials away. This is an example of A. Extinction. B. Punishment. C. Shaping. D. Differential reinforcement. Answer: D. Differential reinforcement. This question describes differential reinforcement, DDR. The scenario involves reinforcing one specific behavior, saying "break please," while simultaneously withholding reinforcement, putting on extinction, for other unwanted behaviors, whining, pushing materials that previously served the same function, escape. Differential reinforcement is about making a distinction, reinforcing the desired behavior and not reinforcing the undesired ones. Extinction is just stopping reinforcement for a behavior. Punishment adds or removes something to decrease behavior. Shaping is reinforcing successive approximations of a single behavior. This example is specifically about reinforcing a replacement behavior while putting the old problem behavior on extinction, which is the core idea of DR. Question 5. A stimulus that has been paired with a primary reinforcer and therefore acquires reinforcing properties is called A. Primary reinforcer. B. Conditioned reinforcer. C. Discriminative stimulus. D. Motivating operation. Answer: B. Conditioned reinforcer. This question defines a conditioned reinforcer, also known as a secondary reinforcer. Primary reinforcers, like food or water, are naturally reinforcing without any prior learning. Conditioned reinforcers gain their power because they have been paired or associated with primary reinforcers or other established conditioned reinforcers. The phrase "paired with a primary reinforcer" and therefore acquires reinforcing properties is the direct definition. Money is a common example. It's not naturally reinforcing, but because it can be exchanged for things like food and shelter, primary reinforcers, it becomes a powerful conditioned reinforcer. Question 6. A child learns to say doggy when they see their own dog. They then start saying doggy when they see pictures of dogs, dogs on TV, and even other people's dogs at the park. This is an example of A. Stimulus discrimination. B. Response generalization. C. Stimulus generalization. D. Behavioral contrast. Answer: C. Stimulus generalization. This scenario describes stimulus generalization. The child learned to tact, label, one specific stimulus, their dog. Stimulus generalization occurs when the learner responds to new, untrained stimuli that share some characteristics with the original trained stimulus. In this case, the stimulus is the dog or picture of a dog, dog on TV, etc., and the child is giving the same response, doggy, to different versions of that stimulus. Response generalization would be doing a different behavior to the same stimulus. Discrimination is the opposite, responding only to the original stimulus. This is about the behavior occurring across different similar stimuli. Question 7. A therapist says, "Clap hands." The child claps their hands. The therapist then gives a high five. The therapist's high five is A. Discriminative stimulus, SD. B. Antecedent. C. Behavior. D. Consequence. Answer: D. Consequence. This question tests your understanding of the three-term contingency. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. The therapist saying "clap hands" is the antecedent, A. The child clapping is the behavior, B. And what happens immediately after the behavior is the consequence, C. The high five happened right after the child clapped, so it is the consequence. It's likely functioning as a reinforcer in this scenario, making the child more likely to clap hands in the future when given the instruction. The SD is the instruction itself. The behavior is the action. The consequence is the environmental change following the behavior. Question 8. Which measurement procedure involves dividing the observation period into intervals and recording whether the behavior occurs at the very end of each interval? A. Partial interval recording. B. Whole interval recording. C. Momentary time sampling. D. Duration recording. Answer: C. Momentary time sampling. This question describes momentary time sampling. In this method, you look up and record whether the behavior is happening exactly at the moment the interval ends. You don't care if it happened earlier in the interval or continued after the moment. This is different from partial interval, any point in the interval, and whole interval. Throughout the entire interval, momentary time sampling is useful for continuous behaviors, or when an observer needs to monitor multiple behaviors or individuals. Remember, momentary means you're only looking at that specific moment when the interval ticks over. Question 9. When implementing a task analysis for a complex skill, what is the relationship between the completion of one step and the next step? A. Completion of a step is a consequence that punishes the previous step. B. Completion of a step is a discriminative stimulus, SD, for the next step. C. Completion of a step automatically extinguishes the previous step. D. Completion of a step is a motivating operation, MO, for the next step. Answer. B. Completion of a step is a discriminative stimulus, SD, for the next step. This question delves into the structure of a behavior chain, which is built using a task analysis. In a chain, each step serves a dual role. It's the consequence for the step that just finished, and it also acts as the discriminative stimulus, SD, that cues the person to perform the next step in the sequence. For example, in hand washing, turning on the water, step 1, is reinforced by the water being on, and the sight/feel of the running water then becomes the SD for the next step. Getting hands wet. The completion of one step literally signals the time and place to do the next. Question 10. A child yells loudly when they want a toy. This behavior has been reinforced by getting the toy in the past. You implement extinction by no longer giving the toy when they yell. You observe the yelling temporarily gets louder and more frequent, and the child starts stomping their feet, which they didn't do before. This temporary increase in yelling and new behavior, stomping, is known as A. Spontaneous recovery, B. Behavioral contrast, C. Extinction burst, D. Punishment side effects. Answer. C. Extinction burst. This scenario is a perfect example of an extinction burst, which is often accompanied by increased variability in behavior. When you stop reinforcing a behavior that was previously reinforced, extinction, you often see a temporary increase in the behavior's frequency, intensity, or duration, the burst, and sometimes the appearance of new behaviors, response variation, that the person tries because the old way isn't working. Spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of the behavior after it has decreased significantly. Behavioral contrast is changes in behavior rate across different settings. This temporary worsening is characteristic of an extinction burst. Question 11. A procedure where reinforcement is delivered for the emission of the problem behavior at a lower rate than before is called A. Differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, DRI. B. Differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, DRA. C. Differential reinforcement of other behavior, DRO. D. Differential reinforcement of low rates, DRL. Answer. D. Differential reinforcement of low rates, DRL. This question describes differential reinforcement of low rates, DRL. The keyword here is lower rate. DRL is used when a behavior is okayed in moderation, but happens too often. You provide reinforcement if the behavior occurs at a rate below a certain level or if a specific amount of time has passed between responses, increasing the interresponse time. DRI reinforces a behavior incompatible with the problem behavior, DRA reinforces an alternative behavior, and DRO reinforces the absence of the behavior for a specific interval. DRL is specifically about reducing the frequency of a behavior, not eliminating it entirely. Question 12. When measuring a behavior that occurs constantly or for very long periods, example, off-task behavior, which measurement method is likely most appropriate? A. Frequency. B. Latency. C. Duration. D. Interresponse time, IRT. Answer. C. Duration. This question asks about the best measurement method for continuous or long-lasting behaviors. When a behavior occurs for extended periods or almost constantly, measuring how many times it starts and stops, frequency, or the time between instances, IRT, isn't very practical or informative. Latency measures the time to start. Duration, which measures how long the behavior occurs from beginning to end, is the most appropriate method for behaviors like staying on task, crying, or tantruming that can last for varying lengths of time. If the behavior is continuous, you need to know how much time is spent doing it. Question 13. A young child sees a yellow school bus and says truck. Later, after being taught the difference, they only say bus for a bus and truck for a truck. This indicates the child has developed A. Stimulus generalization. B. Response generalization. C. Stimulus control. D. Behavioral momentum. Answer: C. Stimulus control. This scenario shows the development of stimulus control. Initially, the child generalized the response truck to a similar stimulus, the bus. After being taught the difference, the child now responds differently in the presence of the bus, saying bus, than they do in the presence of the truck, saying truck. This means their verbal behavior is now under the control of the specific stimulus presented. Stimulus control is demonstrated when a behavior occurs more often in the presence of a specific stimulus, SD, than in its absence or in the presence of another stimulus, SD. They have learned to discriminate. Question 14. A parent gives their child candy, a primary reinforcer, every time they say candy. Over time, the word candy itself becomes a reinforcer for the child, and they will work to hear the parent say candy. This is an example of A. Respondent conditioning, B. Pairing, C. Automatic reinforcement, D. Punishment. Answer: B. Pairing. This question describes the process of pairing, which is how a neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned reinforcer. When you consistently present a neutral stimulus, like the sound of the word candy, immediately before or at the same time as a primary or established conditioned reinforcer, a candy, the neutral stimulus will start to acquire reinforcing properties itself. The child learned to associate the word with the treat, making the word itself rewarding. Respondent conditioning involves pairing stimuli to elicit involuntary responses. Automatic reinforcement doesn't involve another person. Punishment decreases behavior. Pairing is the process that establishes the learned value of a conditioned reinforcer. Question 15. When a behavior decreases in one setting where a punishment procedure is implemented, but increases in another setting where the punishment is not implemented, this phenomenon is called A. Extinction burst, B. Spontaneous recovery, C. Behavioral contrast, D. Generalization. Answer: C. Behavioral contrast. This question describes behavioral contrast. Behavioral contrast occurs when the rate of a behavior changes in one setting in the opposite direction of a change in the rate of behavior in another setting. In this case, the behavior decreases where punished, expected, but this causes it to increase elsewhere where it is not punished or even reinforced. The contrast effect. It's like suppressing the behavior in one place makes it burst out in another. Extinction burst happens when reinforcement is stopped. Spontaneous recovery is a temporary reappearance after extinction. Generalization is the behavior occurring in new settings. Behavioral contrast is specifically about this inverse relationship across environments due to changing contingencies. Question 16. An intervention where you deliver reinforcement for a behavior that cannot physically happen at the same time as the problem behavior is called A. Differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, DRA. B. Differential reinforcement of other behavior, DRO. C. Differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, DRI. D. Differential reinforcement of low rates, DRL. Answer: C. Differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, DRI. This question defines differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, DRI. The keyword is incompatible. DRI involves reinforcing a behavior that is topographically what it looks like, impossible to do at the same time as the problem behavior. For example, reinforcing a child for having hands in pockets is incompatible with hitting or hand biting because they can't do both simultaneously. DRI reinforces any alternative behavior that is not the problem behavior. DRL reinforces the absence of the problem behavior, and DRL reinforces the behavior at a lower rate. DRI is specifically about choosing a behavior that physically prevents the problem behavior from happening. Question 17. You teach a child to say more when they want more juice. Later, the child starts saying more when they want more crackers, more playtime, and more bubbles. This is an example of A. Stimulus generalization. B. Response generalization. C. Stimulus discrimination. D. Behavioral contrast. Answer B. Response generalization. This scenario illustrates response generalization. The original learned response was saying more, controlled by the MO for juice. Response generalization occurs when a new, untrained response, or variations of the trained response, or using the same response in different contexts, occurs in the presence of the same stimulus or situation because it has been reinforced in similar situations in the past. In this case, the child is using the same word/response, more, to get different things, crackers, playtime, bubbles, because the response more has become a generalized way to request different forms of more. Stimulus generalization is using the same response to different stimuli. This is using one response for different desired outcomes. Question 18. When a previously extinguished behavior temporarily reappears after a period of not occurring, this is called A. Extinction burst. B. Spontaneous recovery. C. Behavioral contrast. D. Regression. Answer B. Spontaneous recovery. This question defines spontaneous recovery after a behavior has decreased or stopped completely due to extinction. Reinforcement was removedi. It is possible for the behavior to suddenly reappear, usually at a lower intensity or frequency than during the extinction burst. This temporary return is spontaneous recovery. It shows that the learning hasn't been erased, just suppressed. Extinction burst is the temporary increase when extinction begins. Behavioral contrast is related to changes across settings. Spontaneous recovery is the behavior popping up later after it seemed gone. Question 19. A therapist tells a client to touch blue and points to the blue block at the same time. The pointing is a type of A. Verbal prompt. B. Physical prompt. C. Gestural prompt. D. Model prompt. Answer C. Gestural prompt. This question asks you to identify the type of prompt used. A gestural prompt involves using a physical movement, like pointing, nodding, or looking, to cue the learner to perform the correct response. The therapist's instruction, touch blue, is a verbal cue, SD, but the pointing action is the extra help. A verbal prompt is just spoken words. A physical prompt involves touching or guiding the learner. A model prompt involves showing the learner how to do the behavior. The therapist's point is a clear gestural prompt. Question 20. If a client's behavior is highly variable and does not occur consistently under specific stimulus conditions, it indicates a lack of A. Generalization. B. Discrimination. C. Stimulus control. D. Reinforcement history. Answer C. Stimulus control. This question relates to stimulus control. When a behavior is under stimulus control, it occurs reliably in the presence of a specific stimulus, the SD, and is less likely to occur when that stimulus is absent or a different stimulus is present, SD. If the behavior is happening randomly or not reliably when the SD is present, it means it hasn't come under the control of the environmental cue. This lack of consistency under specific stimulus conditions indicates a lack of stimulus control. Generalization is responding similarly to different stimuli. Discrimination is responding differently to different stimuli, which is part of establishing stimulus control. A lack of reinforcement history could contribute, but the direct result is poor stimulus control. Question 21. Observing that someone behaves differently when they know they are being watched compared to when they don't is an example of A. Reactivity. B. Observer drift. C. IOA. D. Adaptation. Answer A. Reactivity. This describes reactivity, which is when the act of observing and measuring a behavior influences the behavior itself. People, or even animals, might behave differently simply because they know someone is watching or collecting data on them. This can make the data less representative of the behavior's true occurrence under normal conditions. Observer drift is when an observer's interpretation of the behavior definition changes over time. IOA is comparing agreement between observers. Adaptation is getting used to the presence of the observer over time, which reduces reactivity. Reactivity is the initial change in behavior due to being observed. Question 22. An unconditioned reinforcer is one that A. Has acquired its reinforcing value through pairing with other reinforcers. B. Is a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcement. C. Is effective as a reinforcer without any prior learning history. D. Is the first step in a behavior chain. Answer. C. Is effective as a reinforcer without any prior learning history. This question defines an unconditioned reinforcer, also called a primary reinforcer. These are things that are naturally reinforcing because they meet basic biological needs or are inherently pleasurable to most members of a species without needing to be paired with anything else first. Examples include food when hungry, water when thirsty, warmth, or comfort. Option A describes a conditioned reinforcer. Option B describes an SD. Option D describes part of a task analysis. Unconditioned reinforcers are those that work as rewards from day one without needing to be taught or learned. Question 23. You are teaching a child to put on their shirt using a task analysis. You prompt and reinforce the child for doing the last step, pulling the shirt down independently. Once they can do that, you teach them the second to last step and the last step, and so on, working backward through the steps. This teaching procedure is called A. Forward chaining. B. Backward chaining. C. Total task presentation. D. Shaping. Answer. B. Backward chaining. This question describes backward chaining. In backward chaining, you break the skill into steps using a task analysis, but you teach the chain by prompting the learner through all steps except the last one. You teach the last step until the learner can do it independently, and their successful completion of the last step is followed by reinforcement. Once the last step is mastered, you teach the second to last step followed by the last step, reinforcing completion of the chain. You continue teaching backward through the steps. Forward chaining starts with the first step, and total task presentation attempts to teach all steps at once with prompts. Backward chaining is literally teaching the skill starting from the end. Question 24. A behavior analyst uses a procedure where, contingent on a problem behavior, a specific amount of a reinforcer is removed from the individual's access. For example, if a child hits, they lose 5 minutes of tablet time. This procedure is A. Time. Out from reinforcement. B. Response cost. C. Negative reinforcement. D. Extinction. Answer. B. Response cost. This scenario is a classic example of response cost, a form of punishment. The behavior is hitting, and the consequence is the removal or loss of a specific amount of a reinforcer the child previously had access to. 5 minutes of tablet time. This removal makes the hitting behavior less likely in the future. Timeout is temporary removal from a reinforcing environment. Negative reinforcement involves removing something unpleasant to increase behavior. Extinction involves stopping reinforcement that was maintaining the behavior. Response cost is specifically about taking away earned reinforcers. Question 25. If a functional behavior assessment, FBA, identifies that a child's hitting behavior is maintained by escaping difficult tasks, the most appropriate function-based intervention would involve A. Punishing hitting every time it occurs. B. Providing attention when the child hits. C. Teaching the child to request a break appropriately and reinforcing those requests. D. Putting the child in timeout for hitting. Answer C. Teaching the child to request a break appropriately and reinforcing those requests. This question tests your understanding of using FBA results to guide intervention, a core principle in ABA. If the FBA shows the hitting is for escape function, a function-based intervention should address that function. Teaching an appropriate replacement behavior, like asking for a break, that serves the same function, escaping the task, and reinforcing that replacement behavior is a highly effective and ethical approach. Punishing the behavior might suppress it but doesn't teach a new skill. Providing attention would reinforce hitting if attention wasn't the function. And if it was, you teach getting attention appropriately. Time. Out might work by removing reinforcement, but teaching a functional alternative is generally preferred. Always target the function with your intervention.